Hello everyone, you can call me Freebiewitz, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Analyze and Adapt, where I see if a video game would work in 3 different mediums. Tabletop, as in board and card games, tabletop roleplay, like Dungeons and Dragons, and finally, as a Larp. Today, we're taking a look at tabs. For those of you who don't know what tabs is, it stands for Totally Accurate Battle Simulator, and it takes itself as seriously as you might expect just from the visuals alone. It's a game about setting up an army and watching it flail to victory or defeat against another flailing army. Despite how I describe it, the game has a surprising amount of tactical depth to it, even though your decision making mostly comes down to unit selection and placement. Now you can also directly take control of individuals, which adds another level to the strategy, but I won't be focusing too much on that aspect right now. Also, I know what you're all thinking as you watch this. Is this a joke? Kind of, but it's still fun, and that's why I'm doing it. The second question would be, how in the world does one adapt something like tabs into another medium? The answer? With lots of metaphorical flailing. Anyways, I'm not here to only discuss the mechanics of tabs. I'm here to analyze and adapt it, starting with tabletop. So tabs in terms of setting up the board is pretty easy in that all units already have a points cost associated with them. Weaker units such as little hobbits cost 50 points, while a literal god like Zeus is worth 2,000 points. What separates tabs from most other tabletop army type games is the fact that the players can't command the armies after they're deployed. Now I know I mentioned that you can control individuals and we'll adapt that, but let's focus on one thing at a time first. So when the game starts, we'd have a deployment phase for units. Generally speaking, the player who deploys second would have an advantage due to being able to see the first player's army composition and layout. So to mitigate that, there are 2 things off the top of my head that we can do. The first is to give the starting player extra units. The second is to make it a best out of 3 with the loser going second in each round. With so many units running around, how do we keep track of their hit points and stats? Well, luckily we do have precedent. In the game HeroClix, the models have their stats printed on the model's bases themselves, and we can track the tabs character's hit points by rotating a piece of plastic, which are in the base as well. We could always go with Warhammer 40k's method of tracking wounds, but I've always found that somewhat cumbersome, especially when you get lots and lots of units. It usually doesn't come up since most units in that game die after one shot, but that's not the case in tabs. So how do we determine how each unit behaves and moves otherwise? Luckily for us, the units in tabs are dumb as bricks and will just move and attack the closest enemy for the most part. From what I can tell, they only use their special abilities when triggered or whenever they can and all that. While also cumbersome to track, it can be done easily enough. It's formulaic and such. What really concerns me are the ragdoll mechanics. Now I can always roll dice to represent the chaotic nature of combat, and that has precedent in most other existing turn-based wargames. While unit composition and placement play a big role in the outcome of each battle, a lot of what happens in tabs is also at the mercy of the physics engine. Every time a unit rolls a dice to attack, we could have them fall over, as many units often do when they roll a specific number. We can modify that number based on the circumstances and call it flailing or fumbling. Ranged units with guns, for example, would be in more danger of fumbling when in melee, and anyone being hit with an explosive might automatically fumble and trip over as well. In 40k, there's a dice called the scatter dice, filled with arrows and direct hit symbols. We could use the same dice here, except for individual units when they fall over, rather than the inaccurate artillery that 40k uses it for. Despite the cartoony and ridiculousness of the game, ranged weapons are surprisingly accurate. When you deploy your army in tabs, it's less of a competition when you're fighting people and more of a spectator sort of game. The only time I've ever been dissatisfied with a loss was when I was trying to finish a challenge in the campaign mode. When you do that, you're given a preset limit of points and sometimes a limited selection of units. At that point, you're told to defeat the enemy army. Due to the limitations given, I found myself stuck at the later levels, trying every combination of units and formations until I found the ultimate strategy. And that ultimate strategy is taking control of single units. This tactic sometimes doesn't make much difference, but on the right map, with the right composition, it can be devastating. For the board game version, we can give each player the option to directly control a single unit each turn. So while it's mostly an automated affair, the player can nudge things to victory if played right. Failing all that, I feel we can keep the spirit of tabs alive if we just glue googly eyes to some 40k models. Anyways, let's move on to another medium, specifically tabletop roleplay. So the lore in tabs on the surface is pretty non-existent. However, if it did exist, it likely involves some form of time travel. Alternatively, it could just be a group of very dedicated LARPers willing to be hit by cannonballs and occasionally be flung off into the void. That's a bit too meta, so let's just say time travel's involved for now. So taking things at face value, there are a variety of different factions, from the cavemen of the tribal faction to the Asian-inspired dynasty. Ignoring the historical accuracies of each faction, we can see that magic clearly exists in this universe. We have walking skeletons, we have flying Valkyries, and of course Zeus, as in the literal Greek god of thunder and being the father of things that he shouldn't be the father of in the first place. For some reason, this setting has multiple Zeuses, which might explain all the googly eyes. Now, despite the various factions, it's not unheard of multiple factions working together or fighting against themselves. To that end, I propose that there are only two real factions, that being red and blue. In this unending war between the two colors, they have conscripted various soldiers across space and time, even grabbing chunks of landmasses to play host to their battles. The fact that said landmasses float as they do only lends credence to this theory. Also, the fact that the individual units can be directly controlled implies a higher existence that is manipulating these events. But the question then becomes, for what purpose? It's unclear, but due to its open nature, creative game masters will probably think of something, and perhaps make a campaign based around it. We often see these soldiers fumble and flail about, assuming that it's the result of incompetence. But perhaps that's them trying to break free of the mind control. Perhaps when you take control of one, you're exerting your will directly onto these poor innocent souls as you force them to kill their friends and family. Anyways, let's move on to gameplay. Tabs at its core is a relatively large-scale battle simulator. It doesn't quite reach the numbers that some RTS games can reach due to the technological limitations, but it does make a good attempt regardless. Depending on how expensive the units are, we could have a small squad of elites, or an army of brave hobbits. Keep in mind that a pirate captain is worth 1,000 points to deploy, or 20 hobbits worth of points. So outside of combat, there's not much you can do in terms of role-playing. This has been a common theme through my Analyse and Adapt series, but I suppose it's the nature of most video games. Once again, there's nothing wrong with a combat-heavy role-playing game, and if you and your friends like it, then more power to you and your group. So mechanically speaking, there's a lot of flailing. Rolling the dice, as I mentioned in the board game section, would help represent this well enough. What we do different is that every action has a chance of your character fumbling and falling over. There would of course be circumstantial modifiers to this as well. If you have multiple enemies near you, the chance of tripping increases. If you're using a long weapon, your chances of also tripping also increases. Bumpy terrain, being hit by an attack, or just slightly sloping ramps are all potential tripping hazards in this game. Now, fumbling and falling over is usually a bad thing in most RPGs, but in the Tabs RPG adaptation, it might actually be advantageous to do so. Why call it falling over when you can call it diving for cover? Why call it falling over when you can call it a tactical maneuver to cause the enemy to trip over you? Point is, you sometimes want to fall over and fumble on purpose. To that end, there should be a mechanic that increases the chance of just that happening. In Dungeons & Dragons, players can fumble certain actions by rolling a 1 on a 20-sided dice. For Tabs, we can increase that threshold if we wanted to on purpose. Why only make a fumble occur on 1 in 20 rolls? Why can't we increase it to 5 in 20, or even 10 in 20? Hell, if we wanted to go nuts, we can just allow players to fumble on purpose. The power of fumbles seems fairly attainable in this medium, but safety concerns might hold people back in LARP. So let's see if we can get around that in our next analysis. Let's get the simple stuff out of the way first. Weapons such as swords, clubs, and spears are easy enough to do. There are many LARP equipment suppliers that provide foam weapons in all shapes and sizes from the medieval period. Guns such as muskets and revolvers can be gel blasters or whatever blaster equivalent you want. In previous adaptation videos, I've mentioned the safety issue of people running into melee range against people with blasters that shouldn't be shot in melee range. I won't repeat myself too much there, but it's something to keep in mind when going forwards with this game. Then we have magic powers. The Bone Shaman in the game can make a bed of spikes erupt from the ground, flinging enemies into the air. While we can't make literal spikes erupt from the ground, we could have the player make a motion in front of them to roleplay those very same spikes appearing. Anyone close enough to this motion would have to roleplay taking damage and throw themselves backwards. While that might sound goofy to non-LARPers, it's not too different from someone shouting fireball and being hit by a beanbag, or shouting explosion and having everyone near them die. In the video game, this is balanced by the fact that the Shaman is an expensive unit with a long cooldown time on their attacks. If adapted into a LARP setting, however, there's nothing stopping the Bone Shaman from using the ability and then running away to safety until the cooldown refreshes. Nothing, that is, unless we make a rule that stops players from actually running away in the first place. In the video game, everyone except the Bard advances slowly towards the enemy. Slowly, unless you're a mounted unit or something along that line, of course. However, such a style of role-playing combat wouldn't last very long, in that, because nobody runs away or plays tactically, that just becomes a big meat grinder. The fact that units don't respawn in the Tabs universe also doesn't help either. Unless they actually do respawn. Whenever you lose a battle in Tabs, the game state resets with all the units set up like they had been before the battle began. At this point, normally you'd reposition your units, or replace them with others to give you a better chance at victory. Now who's to say that those very same units aren't the same ones every time? Perhaps time is literally being reset after each battle. The fact that time is being manipulated this way isn't too far-fetched either, keeping in mind that we have knights from the medieval era duking it out with musketeers from the Renaissance. So to begin the LARP game, we'll have to have two overseers, red and blue leaders if you would. Based on the equipment that the other players bring, presumably from other LARPs, we can assign them point values. Then we give them some sort of marking, an indication of which side they're fighting on, preferably a red or blue scarf. I should probably point out that I really like scarves, which does make me a bit biased towards them. Siege units, mounts, and other giant units would of course be removed, as there's little to no practical way to implement them. Granted, I've seen padded ballistas be used in LARPs, but a catapult that hits someone head from above is just asking for trouble. Now I understand some hobbies, such as FEMA, are okay with people being hit very hard by non-foam equipment, but I'm trying to keep to LARP, even though I expand it to gel blasters and paintball and such. Anyways, beyond the normal safety concerns, I'm also worried about the flailing that would happen. Even if we give everyone a helmet with eye protection, something still needed if we use gel blasters, it still wouldn't be safe due to the fumbling that players would have to do to make it a real Tabs LARP. Falling over and being trampled on is all in the day's work of the average Tabs soldier, but incredibly unwise for a LARPer to even try. In other words, if done this way, a LARP that adapts Tabs is indistinguishable from any other time-traveling LARP, defeating the point of making it a LARP in the first place. Unless we give everyone googly eyes. Stick those below your real eyes. Stick them between them, above them. Hell, give your swords googly eyes. The more the better! That's how we have a totally accurate battle simulator as a LARP, with the power of googly eyes! So that's my admittingly unhinged analysis of Tabs and how it can be adapted into 3 different mediums. How do you think it'd work? Have any of you tried adapting any elements of the game yourself, and if so, how did it go? Comment, like, and subscribe, and maybe, just maybe, we'll come back to the subject sometime in the future. My name is Freebiewitz, and thank you for watching. You know, with all the ragdolls being thrown about in the game, it kinda reminds me of a kid playing around with floppy dolls and... Wait. Is Tabs just a simulation of a kid violently playing around with dolls? Would that count as a board game? Or is it a tabletop RPG with all their imaginations and role-playing and such? I mean, the actions are being played out right in front of you, so does that count as a LARP? Wait, what counts as a LARP then? I'm so confused. Maybe I should stop thinking about Tabs for a bit.